Everyone laughed when the Chinese billionaire mocked the black waiter, until he replied in Chinese. The Jade Palace glittered like a jewel in the heart of Manhattan. Known as the most exclusive Chinese restaurant in the city, it hosted kings of business, politicians, and billionaires who came to dine beneath its crimson lanterns. That night, laughter rolled across its golden walls, sharp, cruel laughter. At the center of it sat Lightstories, one of Asia's wealthiest women, heir to YE Industries and infamous for her arrogance. She was surrounded by 5 American businessmen who chuckled nervously at everything she said, desperate to secure a deal that could make or break their companies. But their laughter was not from understanding. They didn't know Mandarin. They didn't know that the joke was not just cruel, but poisonous. Liwi smirked, pointing toward the waiter serving their table. Her words, spoken smoothly in Mandarin, dripped with contempt. "Look at that monkey serving us. I doubt he even knows how to hold chopsticks. People like him should be cleaning toilets, not waiting on civilized people like us." The businessmen laughed, awkwardly, trying to appear agreeable. They didn't know what she had said, only that she was mocking the black waiter standing silently before them. That waiter's name was David Thompson. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had swallowed humiliation too many times. For 8 long months, he had worked in that uniform, bowing, pouring wine, carrying trays, all while enduring the invisible whip of prejudice. But tonight, something in his eyes had changed. A dangerous calm burned within him, the kind of calm born only in those who have weathered storms no one else could survive. Liwi leaned back in her chair, savoring her cruelty like fine wine. "That one probably never even finished high school," she sneered in Mandarin, her jeweled fingers twirling her glass. "And yet, in America, they think giving jobs to people like that is progress. What a joke!" The businessmen chuckled again. They still didn't understand the words, but they could sense the disdain in her tone. David heard every syllable, every insult, every slur, and he understood them all. Because what Liwi didn't know, what she couldn't imagine, was that the monkey she mocked in Mandarin was fluent in her language. He had a master's degree in Asian studies from Harvard. He had spent 5 years in Beijing as a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy. He had sat at diplomatic tables negotiating billion-dollar trade deals. 8 months ago, he had been Dr. David Thompson, one of America's leading experts on Sino-American relations. But betrayal had destroyed his career. A jealous colleague at the State Department had framed him for espionage. Though the FBI cleared his name, the stain remained. No university, no government office, no corporation would touch him. His reputation had been poisoned. So here he was, a waiter in a black uniform, invisible to the powerful, enduring daily humiliations from those who thought themselves untouchable. And tonight, Lightstories, the billionaire who prided herself on cruelty, was about to learn how wrong she was. Dinner stretched on like a cruel theater performance. For 40 minutes, Liwi turned the meal into a spectacle of humiliation. She toyed with her words the way a child might torment an insect, careless of its pain, savoring her own power. Every insult was dressed in Mandarin, sharp and deliberate. "This monkey probably thinks he'll get a big tip tonight," she laughed as David set down an appetizer. "Americans are so naive. They give money to people like that and call it progress." The Americans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They couldn't understand her exact words, but they knew cruelty when they heard it. Robert Hayes, CEO of the largest electronics importer on the East Coast, tried twice to change the subject, but Liwi would always circle back, returning her poison to David. At one point, she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You Americans are pathetic," she said, this time alternating between Mandarin and English. "You think giving these people real jobs is progress. Look at him. He can't even hold a tray without shaking." David's hands trembled, but not from fear. His grip was unyielding, but rage pulsed in his veins. 9 months ago, those same hands had been steady while raising a glass beside ambassadors in Washington. 9 months ago, he was the man at the head of the table, guiding billion-dollar negotiations. Now he was being mocked as if he were less than human. But he endured, silent, watching, cataloging every word, every gesture, every moment. And then came the question. Liwi waved him closer, her jeweled rings catching the light. She pointed as one might summon a dog. "You, what is your name?" "David, ma'am," he answered quietly. "David," she repeated, as if tasting something bitter. "Have you ever heard of China, David? Do you know where it is on the map?" The businessman froze. Even they, seasoned veterans of ruthless deals, recognized the cruelty had gone beyond anything acceptable. "Yes, ma'am," David replied, his voice calm. Liwi burst into loud laughter. "How cute! He knows where China is!" She switched back to Mandarin, her voice dripping with venom. "I would bet my fortune this monkey has never set foot outside New York in his life." It was at that precise moment that something shifted in the air of the restaurant. David paused, lifting his gaze. For the first time that evening, his eyes locked directly on hers. Not submissive, not afraid, but steady, unyielding, dangerous. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even the nervous chuckles of the Americans faltered. What they didn't know, what Liwi couldn't see, was that every word was building something inside David. Each insult was fuel, each humiliation was a spark. And deep within him, a storm was forming. The breaking point was near. The Americans excused themselves after dessert, pretending not to notice the cruelty that had poisoned their meal. Handshakes were exchanged, polite smiles plastered on uneasy faces. And then they were gone, leaving the private dining room heavy with silence. Only 2 people remained. Liwi, still basking in her performance, and David, still standing in his waiter's uniform, his posture calm, his tray balanced perfectly, his silence unbroken. She leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine. "You've been very obedient tonight," she said in Mandarin. "But I suppose obedience is all men like you are capable of." David didn't move. His eyes stayed lowered, but inside, something had clicked into place. 9 months of exile, 9 months of humiliation, 9 months of swallowing fire without releasing the smoke. All of it had led to this room, this night, this moment. Because what Liwi didn't know, what no one in this restaurant knew, was that David was not simply a man who had fallen from grace. He was a man who had once stood at the highest tables of power. He had secrets, he had knowledge, he had scars from wars no newspaper had dared to print. And while she saw a waiter in a cheap vest, what she truly faced was a weapon disguised as a servant. The secret weapon wasn't his fists. It wasn't a hidden gun or even the connections he once commanded. It was something far more dangerous. His silence, his patience, his ability to let an enemy speak so long, so loudly, that eventually they buried themselves. David knew the Americans hadn't missed everything. They had seen enough, heard enough, and when the time came, he would not need to raise his voice or lift a hand. He would only need to remind the right people, quietly, precisely, who he really was. And then what? Li Wei's empire of cruelty would collapse under its own weight. But tonight, David gave her one final gift. As he cleared her glass, he leaned just close enough for her to hear, his voice steady, his Mandarin flawless. "You should be careful who you call a monkey." Her smirk faltered. For the first time, the predator felt the shadow of prey. The game had begun. Li Wei left the restaurant that night, certain she had won. She believed she had broken him, reduced him to nothing more than a shadow in a cheap uniform. But David knew the war had just started. The next morning, he returned to the restaurant like any other day, silent, efficient, invisible. He refilled water glasses. He polished cutlery until it gleamed. He carried heavy trays without complaint. Yet behind the stillness of his eyes, the first move was already in motion. When the Americans had left the night before, they hadn't gone straight back to their hotel. They had lingered at the bar downstairs, whispering to each other about what they had seen. And David, quietly moving past with a tray of empty cups, had caught every word. "If that's how she treats him in public," one of them muttered. "Imagine what she's hiding in private," another replied. They weren't fools. They knew a mask when they saw one. And the seed of doubt, once planted, grows like fire in dry grass. David didn't need to expose Li Wei. She was exposing herself. All he needed to do was wait. And so he watched as she grew more careless, more arrogant. Watched as she snapped at staff, belittled clients, laughed too loudly at her own cruelty. He let her believe she still owned the stage. But every insult, every outburst, every slip of the mask was quietly witnessed, quietly remembered, quietly carried forward by the only weapon David needed, the truth. One night, as he collected coats by the entrance, an American executive paused, slipping a folded card into his hand. No words, just a card, a name and a number, and a glance that said, "When you're ready." For the first time in months, David allowed himself the smallest smile. The world thought he was finished. Li Wei thought she had broken him. But the truth was simple. The first move wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even visible. The first move was silence, so sharp it could cut glass. And the blade had just been unsheathed. It began small, almost invisible. But every empire, no matter how tall, always crumbles from the inside. Li Wei still strutted into the restaurant as though the world bent at her command. Her voice sliced the air, sharp with condescension, her laughter echoing like broken glass. But something had shifted. The room no longer bent with her. It stiffened. The American executives no longer leaned forward when she spoke. They leaned back. Their eyes wandered, their brows furrowed, their smiles tightened into polite masks. The staff, once trembling in her presence, now exchanged subtle glances behind her back. And David, still silent, still invisible, stood at the edges, watching it all unfold. The card in his pocket had not yet been used. It didn't need to be. Li Wei was unraveling herself. One night during a dinner meant to impress investors, she snapped at a junior staff member for bringing the wrong wine. Her voice was shrill, her words venom. But this time, no one laughed. No one nodded. The air was heavy with something new, disapproval. An American, the one who had slipped David the card, set his glass down with quiet finality. His eyes shifted, not to Li Wei, but to the silent man in the corner refilling glasses without a sound. And in that gaze, David saw it. The balance of power shifting. Not with a storm, not with thunder, but with silence. Because silence does not beg. Silence does not defend. Silence waits until the truth is louder than any voice. Later that night, Li Wei cornered David in the hallway, her perfume sharp as poison. "You think your silence makes you strong? You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." David didn't flinch, didn't speak. He only held her gaze, unblinking, unbroken. And in that moment, for the very first time, she looked away. That was the beginning. The mask had cracked. The unmasking had begun. It came like thunder after a long, tense storm. The night was meant to be her triumph, Li Wei's grand showcase. Executives from across the ocean, journalists with their pens poised, cameras catching every flicker of her painted smile. She swept into the hall like a queen arriving at her coronation. Her dress shimmered, her laugh rang false but loud, and her words, sharp as ever, cut through the air. But the cracks, they were no longer hidden. Her cruelty slipped faster now, her mask breaking with each lash of her tongue. She barked at a server for spilling a single drop of wine. She mocked an assistant's accent. And when a young hostess stumbled over her English, Li Wei's laugh, cruel, high, merciless, filled the room. The room did not laugh with her. It froze. Every eye turned, not to the girl, not to the mistake, but to Li Wei. And standing quietly at the far wall, refilling glasses without fanfare, was David. The same David she had humiliated, belittled, dismissed. The man of silence. And now, silence roared louder than her voice. One executive leaned toward another, whispering. A journalist's pen scratched faster. The same American who had slipped David the card now studied him openly, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. Li Wei's voice faltered. For the first time in years, she felt it, the shift, the invisible chains she had bound around others snapping loose. Because silence was no longer weakness, it was defiance. It was judgment. It was freedom. And David, still silent, still steady, stood taller than her empire ever could. By the end of the night, her smile had cracked beyond repair, and though she didn't yet know it, Li Wei's reign had ended, not with noise, but with silence. The chains were breaking. It began quietly, almost invisibly. A meeting cancelled, a contract delayed, an investor who needed more time. Li Wei, who once commanded rooms with a snap of her fingers, now found herself snapping them into emptiness. Calls went unanswered, smiles turned strained, and whispers followed her wherever she walked. She blamed everyone but herself. Her assistants, the weak partners, even David, always David, standing too straight, too calm, too unbroken. She screamed louder, but the louder she screamed, the more hollow her voice became. And David, he never flinched. Each day he carried on as before, quiet, efficient, unshaken. But his silence now carried weight, a mirror no insult could shatter. Wherever he went, people noticed. They began to lean toward him, not her. A nod of respect from a journalist, a kind word from a partner, the quiet acknowledgement that dignity does not need a stage. It drove her mad, because the one she had mocked as powerless now stood as proof of her weakness. Then came the night of the press scandal, a leaked recording, her cruel laughter, her insults, her sneer at those beneath her, circulated like wildfire. The empire she had built on fear crumbled in hours. The sponsors withdrew, the press circled. Her name became a curse whispered in boardrooms. And through it all, David remained silent. But that silence was no longer invisible. It was thunder in every corner of the room. By the week's end, Liwi's empire lay in ashes, not toppled by rivals, not destroyed by lawsuits, but undone by the truth she had tried to bury, a truth reflected in the silent man she could never break. The queen had fallen, and the waiter still did not bow. The cafe was no longer just a cafe. People came not for the coffee, but for the man who never raised his voice, yet made them feel seen. Executives, journalists, even strangers who had once bowed before Liwi's empire now sat in the humble wooden chairs, waiting, not for speeches, but for silence that carried truth. David never asked for it, but respect has a way of finding those who refuse to trade it for power. Soon he was invited into boardrooms, not as a servant, but as an equal. And when he spoke, brief, simple words, they cut sharper than any lecture. Integrity is louder than noise. That line, whispered once in passing, became the headline of a magazine cover. Liwi watched from the shadows. Her name, once carved in glass towers, now scraped away. His, written softly, now carried weight she could never command. And yet, David never gloated. He never pointed back at her fall. He simply lived day after day, with the same steady hands, the same quiet eyes, the same dignity she had once tried to crush. The world began to call him many things: a leader, a visionary, a man of quiet power. But to him, he was only what he had always been, a waiter who refused to bow to cruelty. And in that refusal, he found something greater than victory. He found freedom. The silence had spoken, and this time, the world listened. Years passed. The cafe remained. Not the largest, not the richest, not the most glamorous. But within its walls, generations found something no palace could buy. A reminder that dignity does not shout, and true power does not humiliate. David grew older. His steps slowed, his hair silvered, but his silence never lost its weight. Children, who once visited with their parents, now brought their own, telling them, "This is where the man taught us that respect doesn't need a crown." When David was gone, they lit a single candle at his table. No plaque, no golden statue, no speeches, only silence. And yet the silence spoke louder than monuments. People remembered the man who had been nothing more than a waiter, who refused to be broken, who never sought revenge, but simply lived with quiet truth. His story spread far beyond the cafe, far beyond the city. In schools, in homes, in boardrooms, they whispered his words. Integrity is louder than noise. And in that whisper, David lived on. Liwi's empire crumbled, forgotten by time. But the man she tried to humiliate became immortal. Not in riches, not in marble, but in the quiet strength he left behind. Because sometimes the loudest voice is silence. We invite you to join Midlight Stories if this story strikes a chord with you, makes you smile, or stirs up strong emotions in you. Each story is meant to uplift, heal, and remind you of the beauty that comes from human connection. Share this story with someone who believes in kindness and second chances by clicking the subscribe button and turning on the notification bell. Keep your heart open till we cross paths again, because you never know when someone might ask, "Can I join you here?"